It's my pleasure to introduce now John Reimann. È un segretario del sindacato era un segretario del sindacato dei carpentieri in San Francisco, questo fino al 99, quando viene espulso per il suo ruolo di organizzatore di scioperi selvaggi, scioperi che erano sia contro i padroni che contro i quadri sindacali. Questa infatti è un'espulsione che è parte della lenta morte del sindacalismo americano, che secondo me è parte del processo che ci porta oggi a Trump e il mondo cosiddetto multipolare, multiimperialista. John è un attivista internazionalista, socialista, che dagli anni 90 ad oggi ha partecipato e collaborato e visitato i movimenti dei lavoratori in Egitto, Pakistan, Venezuela, UK, Ucraina e altrove. È stato il fondatore di Ukraine Socialist Solidarity Campaign, uno dei primi gruppi di solidarietà internazionale per la guerra in Ucraina, stabiliti negli Stati Uniti, ed è correntemente ancora impegnato nel contrastare la propaganda russista che divide le sinistre occidentali, ed è un curatore dell'ottimo blog che raccomando, Auckland Socialist. Ci parlerà del significato globale della presidenza Trump-Musk, ci parlerà della crisi della classe operaia americana e delle prospettive di resistenza e opposizione. So, John, thank you again for being here. I have to remind you that we are getting a bit short with time, but well, the floor is yours. Thank you again.
Well, comrades, first of all, thank you for inviting me to speak here, and I hope we can meet in person at some point in the future. I will start by recalling an event in 1978 in Jonestown, Guyana. There, some 600 followers of the cult leader Reverend Jim Jones committed mass suicide by drinking cyanide-laced Kool-Aid, which they also fed to nearly 300 of their children. And that is not that different from the situation of Donald Trump and the MAGA cult. And now, just in the last 48 hours, we have a rapidly developing constitutional crisis, and the Trump administration is actually feeding some of its most highly classified state secrets to foreign rivals. To understand the international consequences of this national disaster, we have to consider the concept of Eurasianism, which was first proposed in the 1940s by the US-born and European-based fascist Francis Parker Yockey. And he proposed that continental Europe should be one united whole and should drive out the influence of Britain and the United States. Today, Russian fascist Alexander Dugin takes up the same theme of Eurasianism, but with Russia dominating the entire continent. And Trump accepts that idea with the corollary that he and his country should dominate the Atlantic, from Britain to Greenland to Canada and down to the Panama Canal. In other words, what could be called Atlanticism. And what will go along with that is that China can have all of Asia. Now, even if this scenario were possible, it does not mean, quote, peace. There will be an intensified battle between these rivals for dominance in Southwest Asia, North Africa, in Sub-Saharan Africa, and South America. And this battle will heat up, and war is possible, even possibly a nuclear war, if we keep going down this road. This is part of the reason why what happens in US politics has global consequences, and therefore should be understood by workers and socialists among them the world over. And I hope the points that I will raise will help further that understanding. Now let's start by looking at what happened in the 2008 financial crisis, when then President Obama bailed out finance capital and left the workers to fend for themselves. The result was a populist movement called the Tea Party movement. As an anti-government rather than anti-corporate movement, it was a right-wing movement, and the Republican Party drew it into their midst, and for the first time in their history, they actually developed a mass base. The question is, why was the 2008 revolt along right-wing rather than anti-corporate, which is to say left-wing lines? And the answer is something that no wing of the US socialist movement ever discusses, to my knowledge: the devastating political crisis of the US working class. What we have had is an 80-year war conducted first and foremost by the US union leadership against all of the best traditions of the labor movement. The union leadership demobilized the membership while they carried out a propaganda campaign that the unions and the employers were on the same team and that all the traditions of the past were dead and gone. These included the traditions of working class solidarity, of mass defiance, of a struggle for political independence and for socialism. And it wasn't just a propaganda campaign. It was aimed at any member who struggled to maintain those traditions. Those members were ostracized, they were blackballed, they were physically threatened and assaulted, and some of them were expelled from the unions. And I could speak for an hour and a half on this 80-year war, having experienced it personally myself. This war had a massive effect on the US working class, to the extent that probably at least half of US workers support Trump, and the other half are more or less politically passive. And to think otherwise, to think this war had no impact on the consciousness of the US working class, is idealism. And this left a huge vacuum into which stepped Trump. And I think this situation, by the way, is not exclusive to the United States. Now, until fairly recently, Trump in the main did not have the backing of any significant sector of the US capitalist class. But that started to change last year or maybe a little bit earlier. And leading the way was the Silicon Valley venture capitalists. This enormously important wing of the capitalist class had torn down and then rebuilt to their own liking a massively important industry, the communication and entertainment industry. And bear in mind that by communication, we are including not only mass communication, Twitter, Facebook, the New York Times, and so on. We're also talking about data transmission, which lies at the heart of the globalization of capitalism. And in the process of rebuilding this industry, they smashed any attempts by the workers in that industry to organize. And with that crowning victory, they thought, well, why can't we remodel all of US society along these lines, and maybe the entire world, as we did with our industry? And who better for us to use in accomplishing this goal but Donald Trump? And so, led by them, major sectors of the rest of the capitalist class moved into the Trump camp. In part, by the way, those other sectors of the capitalist class had been put off by some concessions that Biden had made to the working class. They did not see any need for Biden to make any concessions to the working class, which was so fragmented and confused. In other words, we're talking about the crisis in the US working class. And so that is why major wings of the capitalist class, possibly the majority of them, ended up supporting Trump in last year's election. Trump and MAGA have also taken over the Supreme Court, which made a key ruling last year that paved the way for Trump to return to the White House. They ruled that a president is immune from criminal prosecution for anything he does in office, so long as it is done related to his official duties. Netanyahu, by the way, must be jealous. So that means that a president can literally take bribes and it is legal. It means that a president can literally pass on the most highly classified state secrets to a rival capitalist government. In other words, as they say, to betray his country, and it is legal. This ruling was made when Trump was under considerable legal threats, and it paved the way for him coming into office. As for the Democratic Party, both during the election and since then, they have tried to play a middle ground. They tried to please both the capitalists and the increasingly polarized working class, and the result was that they pleased nobody. And so, while Trump has had some not very good polling numbers, The Democratic support has been even worse. In a recent poll, they received 27% support. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that that will be the vote of their candidates in the elections in 2 years from now, but that says a lot. Now, let us look at what Trump has done since he returned to office. And really, it should be called the Trump, Vance, Musk triumvirate. That is who's running the executive branch of this government, running Congress, and also at least the US Supreme Court. And I want to emphasize again that what I'm about to recount will have, in fact, is already having direct international consequences in Palestine, in Ukraine, and in Italy and beyond. During Trump's first term in office, he made a series of appointments that were more loyal to the demands of the US capitalist class than to Trump personally. And he learned from that. And this time, direct personal loyalty to himself and himself alone is the main central requirement to be appointed to any position in his administration. Or to put it another way, they must be willing to violate all laws as well as the sacred US Constitution itself if Trump demands it. I don't have time to review the appointments, but I should add that aside from personal loyalty to Trump, some of them are connected to Putin and or Xi, and others are fascist sympathizers, if not outright fascists. And I don't use that term lightly. Now, in terms of Trump's major foreign policy initiatives, he has moved to give Israel a completely free hand, and he has infamously aligned himself with Putin regarding the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I mentioned at the outset Trump's threats regarding Greenland, Canada, and Panama. Domestically, Musk's Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, is central. Through DOGE, Trump has elevated Elon Musk into the position of co-president. And what DOGE has been doing in slashing tens of thousands of workers from different federal agencies is part and parcel of a plan to completely dismantle these agencies and then use that as an excuse to privatize them, many of them under the control of Elon Musk's own businesses. Part of this also would be raiding of the funds within some of those agencies, such as Social Security. So what you have is a giant privatization, repression, and corruption scam on a scale that would make even Putin proud. And by the way, you can be sure that people like Nigel Farage in Britain and the AfD in Germany, and you probably have equivalents there in Italy, are watching this sort of thing and are learning from it. Then you have the ethno-nationalist attacks on immigrants, which is part and parcel of the increased repression in general, and will most likely be used in the future as an excuse to call out either the National Guard or actually the army itself, or both. And we should never forget the coming assault on the environment, an assault that will be felt all around the world, including, but not only, on the situation of global climate disruption. Also, there is the important tendency of this triumvirate to actually defy the federal courts, which means there are no checks on the actions of the triumvirate except for any movement from below. Also, Trump's tariff initiative will have a direct global impact. He basically wants to use the tariff threat in order to bludgeon other governments into line. And it threatens not only to massively disrupt the US economy, but in fact, global capitalism itself, partly because investors don't know what's coming from one day to the next. For this reason, and also because of Trump lining himself up with one of the main rivals of US capitalism, Russian capitalism, especially in regard to Ukraine. For these reasons, major wings of the US capitalist class are starting to have serious doubts about Trump. But what can they do about him? They cannot use the rest of the Republican Party against him. It's increasingly clear that the judiciary will not or cannot rein him in. And their media, the old-line TV stations and newspapers, for example, no longer have the influence on the masses of Americans that it used to have. The unprecedented nature of this situation is revealed by Trump's first action on his first day in office, which was to pardon the 1,500 federal prisoners who had been convicted for their role on the January 6th coup attempt. Incidentally, when they were deciding who to pardon and who not to, Trump famously said, well, fuck it, let's just pardon them all. These are violent fascist organizers, and many of them will certainly be out there organizing as we speak today, right this minute. And as opposed to the past, they will have the financial backing of the Nazi-saluting Elon Musk. This means the potential for a mass fascist paramilitary. And to give an example of what is happening, there is the eugenics conference, which is literally Nazi science, planned in the deep Republican state of Texas. And the University of Texas is associated with this conference, as is Elon Musk himself indirectly. And if 10 to 15 years ago, anybody had told me we'd be seeing this sort of thing here, I'd have told them they are hysterical. I'm not saying that fascism is literally about to take power in the US, but I never would have thought we had seen what we are seeing here today. Another possibility is this. In a situation of mass crisis, to which Trump might respond by trying to call out the military, possibly to prevent a setback of his party in the 2026 by-elections, I think that it is not ruled out that under the right circumstances, wings of the military could actually start to take their independence of the civilian government, which is to say of the presidency. It is a question that certainly needs to be thought through a lot more, especially because it would be totally unprecedented in all of US history. That is to say, for the military to act against the president, which is to say they would be doing it on behalf of the US capitalist class. So now let's look for a minute at the opposition that is starting to develop. We have had all around the country, including in my area, a whole host of little local protests, almost all of which have been controlled either by the union bureaucracy or the non-profiteers, both of which are linked to the Democratic Party. The union leadership has been almost entirely silent, or in some cases it would be better if they had been silent. Now you do have Sarah Nelson, the president of the flight attendants, who several weeks ago called for a national general strike, but there's no indication that she's doing anything to organize along those lines. So the result is that we cannot rule out the possibility of a mass revolt, but I think that it would be chaotic and disorganized, something similar maybe to the French Yellow Vest movement of 2018. If that were to happen, then the role of socialists, I believe, would be to encourage it, to emphasize the centrality of the working class struggle and the need for working class independence and, quite frankly, for socialism. I think there are two things, meanwhile, that we can and should be advocating. And this is where I'll conclude. First and foremost, for the movement in general, we have to see that the triumvirate is actually extremely vulnerable in one key industry, and that is food production. It is vulnerable because there a huge proportion of the workforce is immigrant labor, and the majority of that labor is undocumented. Already, many of them are staying off from work for fear of being rounded up and deported. So what I think we should advocate is that the union should organize in that sector, encourage those workers to, in effect, go on strike, which is to say what they're already starting to do, and organize union members and supporters to stand the strike picket lines for them. If that even started to happen, the US grocery store shelves would be empty within a week. Now, of course, the union leadership is not going to do that without a massive pressure from below. Now, the second thing that I think all socialists around the world should think about is the crying need for an international working class solidarity campaign. Such a campaign would make the links between the struggle against repression of people from Palestine to Ukraine, from Italy to the United States, while emphasizing the absolutely central role of the working class, that the working class must be the center and must lead these struggles. Because if it doesn't, then such struggles will inevitably be controlled by the capitalist class, and it will not achieve the results for which so many hundreds of thousands, millions in fact, of people have sacrificed and struggled. Look, for example, at the Great Revolution, which finally overthrew the fascistic Assad in Syria. Today, the new Syrian government is maneuvering, tacking back and forth between the dictates of the governments of the regional powers, Turkey and Israel, and global powers, the US and Russia, with China hovering in the background. As a movement that, no matter how heroic it may have been, was never led by the working class, and as a capitalist government, when it came time to make international links, which is unavoidable in every instance, when that time came, it had to make links with regional and global capitalist powers. The only other alternative would have been a working class-led revolution that made links with the international working class and helped to develop an international working class movement. That is and will be the same in every single other instance around the world. It does not mean that socialists do not support such movements, but we have to help draw the lessons of the centrality of the world working class and its the necessity for international working class solidarity. I hope that one result of this conference and similar efforts will be considered taking up this banner for a campaign for international working class solidarity. Thank you very much, comrades.